The dust of Ethel tasted of rust and regret, a fine red powder that settled on everything, a constant reminder of the world that was. To Dr. Eris Thorne, it was the taste of history. She spent her days in the skeletal remains of the progenitors, the great metal-boned cities that clawed at the perpetually overcast sky. Their creators long turned to the very dust she now breathed. The people of Ethel, her people, lived in the valleys between these iron giants, in towns of packed earth and scavenged plating, their lives governed by the harvest and the hunt. They remembered the progenitors only in myth, as gods who had angered the heavens and been struck down for their hubris. Eris knew better. Hubris had been a part of it, certainly, but the truth was far more complex and terrifying. She was a keeper of scraps, an archaeologist and historian in a society that had little use for the past beyond cautionary tales whispered around a dwindling fire. Her workshop, a reinforced bunker tunneled into the foundation of a shattered spire, was a heresy of scavenged datalocks, fragmented memory crystals, and books whose pages crackled like dry leaves. For 10 years she had pieced together the story not of gods, but of men and women who had commanded energies that could unmake stars, who had strode across the galaxy in vessels of light and fury. They hadn't been struck down by heavens, they had been broken in a war, a conflict so total and devastating it had shattered their civilization, bombed their technology back to the level of the forge and the plow, and stranded the survivors on this forgotten world to be erased by time. The day the new gods came, the sky bled. It was not the angry red of a dust storm or the bruised purple of twilight, but a clean, piercing silver. A ship, impossibly vast and elegant, descended through the perpetual gray clouds with the silent grace of a predator. It was fashioned from a material that seemed to drink the light, its form a cascade of harmonious curves and gentle angles that was an insult to the jagged, broken architecture of the progenitor ruins. The people in the valley settlement of Oakhaven fell to their knees, some in terror, others in awestruck worship. This was the fulfillment of prophecy, the return of the skyfolk. Eris watched from the entrance to her bunker, a chrono lens pressed to her eye, her heart a cold, frantic drum against her ribs. She felt no awe, only a dread that coiled in her gut like a serpent. These were not their progenitors returning. The energy signatures were wrong, the design philosophy alien. She had studied the schematics of 1,000 progenitor vessels from the archives. They were brutal, angular things, built for function and war, not aesthetics. This ship was something else, something new and perhaps far more dangerous. The consortium, as they called themselves, were beings of unnerving calm and effortless superiority. The first to emerge was a prelate Voral, a creature tall and slender, whose multipartite limbs moved with a liquid ease. Its skin was the color of polished obsidian, and its large, multifaceted eyes held a look of profound, almost sorrowful, intelligence. Through a floating translation drone that spoke the ancient high tongue of the progenitors with perfect syntax, it expressed deep regret for humanity's plight and offered a hand of galactic fellowship. Prelate Voral was a xenosociologist of esteemed reputation, and the discovery of the lost Ethel colony was the capstone of his career. To him, these humans were a tragic marvel, a species that had clearly suffered a catastrophic technological collapse, regressing to a pre-industrial state. Their myths of starfire and skyships were classic examples of cargo cult deification of forgotten ancestors. They were a perfect candidate for the consortium's uplift mandate, a benevolent policy of gradual technological and cultural integration as for promising primitive species. Voral walked through Oakhaven with a team of specialists, his drones cataloging, analyzing, and assessing. He saw the crude ironworks, the subsistence farming, the tribal social structures, and felt a paternalistic pity. He saw the ritualistic combat training practiced by the village's warden caste, fierce men and women who hone their bodies into weapons as a barbaric but understandable response to a harsh environment. He saw their reverence for the progenitor ruins as a poignant, if misguided, spiritualism. He did not see the truth. He could not. His worldview, shaped by millennia of the consortium's peaceful, ordered expansion, had no framework for what humanity had truly been. The consortium absorbed species. It did not conquer them. It offered enlightenment, medicine, and peace. And in return, new members willingly integrated, their sharper cultural edges smoothed away until they fit seamlessly into the whole. Vorel believed with absolute sincerity that he was saving the people of Aethel. He never once considered that he was poking a sleeping god of war. In her bunker, surrounded by the ghosts of a fallen empire, Eris Thorn worked with a desperate intensity. The arrival of the consortium had provided a missing piece of her puzzle. Their ship constantly broadcast a low-level identification signal, a string of coded harmonics meant to identify them to other spacefaring races. Using her scavenged equipment, she managed to isolate and analyze it. When she cross-referenced the signal's core resonance frequencies with the battle logs she'd painstakingly recovered from a progenitor warship's black box, her blood ran cold. The frequencies were a perfect match. The consortium was not a new galactic power. It was the modern name for the very same alliance of alien races that had hunted the progenitors to the brink of extinction millennia ago. The war had never truly ended for them. The Uplift mandate was not an act of benevolence. It was a cleanup operation, a final, insidious tool to ensure the human scourge, as the war logs called her ancestors, could never rise again. It was a program of cultural and biological pacification designed to strip away the very traits that had made humanity such a terrifying force in the galaxy: their aggression, their obsessive ingenuity, their terrifying capacity for unity in the face of an existential threat. The consortium didn't want allies. They wanted pets. They were neutering humanity, not saving it. Her people were kneeling to their ancient executioners, welcoming them with open arms, and she was the only one who knew it. The friction began subtly. Vorel's uplift teams, with the best of intentions, began to implement changes. They introduced advanced agricultural techniques that rendered the old ways obsolete, eroding the authority of the village elders. They offered medical treatments that cured ailments in hours, making the wisdom of the hedge witches seem like foolish superstition. Then they turned their attention to the wardens. Vorel identified their constant combat drills and warrior traditions as a source of social instability, a relic of their barbaric past that needed to be phased out for humanity to embrace a more civilized, consortium-approved way of life. He issued a decree the wardens were to lay down their arms, their swords of scavenged progenitor alloy, their razor-edged throwing discs. All of it was to be surrendered and replaced with consortium pacification tools, stun batons, and sonic emitters designed for crowd control. The warden captain, a grim-faced man named Kalen, whose family had guarded Oakhaven for 20 generations, refused. He stood in the village square, his ancestral blade in hand, and told Prelate Vorel that his weapon was his soul, and he would not surrender it. Eris watched the confrontation from a distance, a knot of ice in her stomach. She knew Kalen, knew his unbending honor. She also knew, from the progenitor logs, that the consortium did not tolerate defiance. Prelate Vorel was not angered. He was disappointed. The humans' stubborn attachment to archaic violence was precisely the sort of problematic trait the Uplift mandate was designed to correct. He had no desire to harm them. He ordered his security team to demonstrate the superiority of peaceful compliance. Set pacifiers to minimum intensity. He commanded the drone. Subdue them. We will take their weapons, and then we will begin their re-education. The consortium guards, clad in sleek gray armor, advanced on Kalen and his 20 wardens. They raised their sonic emitters, which let out a low, warbling hum. Kalen and his wardens braced themselves, expecting pain, expecting to be thrown back. They did not expect what happened next. The moment the sonic waves washed over them, they began to scream. It was not a sound of pain, but of pure, unadulterated agony. Their bodies convulsed violently, and thick, black blood erupted from their eyes, ears, and mouths. Their muscles tore themselves from their bones, and their bodies collapsed into twitching, ruined heaps. In less than 10 seconds, all 21 wardens were dead, their faces frozen in masks of horrific torment. A stunned silence fell over the square, broken only by the gentle hum of the consortium's drone. Vorel stared, his multifaceted eyes wide with shock and confusion. The pacifiers were designed to cause temporary synaptic disruption in most carbon-based life forms. Such a reaction was impossible. It was an anomaly, a tragic, unforeseen biological incompatibility. But to the people of Oakhaven, who had just watched their protectors literally torn apart from the inside out by the serene visitors from the sky, it was not an accident. It was a massacre. It was a declaration of war. Panic and rage erupted in equal measure. The villagers scattered, their awe replaced with primal terror. The consortium guards, confused by the unexpected outcome, formed a defensive circle around the horrified prelate. In that instant of chaos, Eris Thorn knew her time had run out. They would come for her next. Her knowledge was too dangerous. They would call her a fearmonger, a reactionary trying to sabotage their benevolent work. And they would silence her. She sprinted back to her bunker, sealing the heavy blast door behind her. Her hands flew across the controls of the central console, a massive piece of progenitor technology she had spent years carefully restoring. The archive spoke of a last resort contingency, a finale-was desperate act of their dying empire known only as the Harrowing Protocol. It was a weapon, she had always assumed, a doomsday device she had been terrified to investigate too closely. But as she translated the final lines of the activation sequence, she realized it wasn't a weapon meant for the enemy. It was a message meant for their children. With shaking fingers, she typed the final command. Deep within the planet's crust, in geothermal caverns and hidden sub-bunkers, systems that had lain dormant for 5,000 years began to stir. Power surged through colossal conduits, reawakening slumbering fabricators and cloning vats. Ancient orbital platforms, disguised as asteroid, vented atmosphere and ignited their long, cold fusion cores. On the surface, a low, guttural hum vibrated up through the soles of Eris's boots, a sound that seemed to shake the very bones of the world. Prelate Vorel, still reeling from the bloody incident in the square, felt the tremor and looked to the sky, ordering his ship's sensors to scan for seismic activity, but the threat was no longer on the ground. The perpetual gray cloud cover over Ethel began to swirl, not from wind, but as if being burned away from above. Great rents of angry, crimson light tore through the atmosphere, revealing a sky that was no longer empty. It was filled with ships, hundreds of them. They were not the elegant, curved vessels of the consortium. They were brutal, ugly things of scarred iron and sharp angles, bristling with weapons that violated a dozen of the consortium's fundamental laws of civilized warfare. And on the hull of each ship, glowing with the heat of freshly powered reactors, was a single, ancient symbol, a clenched human fist crushing a star. The harrowing protocol wasn't a weapon. It was an automated, galaxy-wide summons. A rallying cry sent across dark space to every lost fleet, every hidden fortress, every forgotten colony of the old human empire. It was a signal that simply said, "We have been found. The old enemy is here. Wake up. It is time to hunt again." Down in her bunker, as alarms blared and the world began to tear itself apart, Eris Thorne watched the fleet descend on her view screen and allowed herself a single, grim smile. The age of humanity was over. The age of humanity had just begun. For Prelate Vorel, the universe had inverted. One moment, he was a scholar and a diplomat, managing a regrettable but necessary disciplinary action against a primitive culture. The next, he was the epicenter of a historical cataclysm. The sky, once a familiar gray canvas, was now a tapestry of brutalist starships that seemed to tear holes in reality just by existing. They were a fleet of ghosts, iron coffins resurrected from a forgotten age of violence, and their silence was more terrifying than any war cry. Before his ship, the stelliferous Quill, could even raise its shields to full power, the attack came. It wasn't a volley of missiles or a blast of energy lances. It was a wave of pure information, a data scythe that sliced through the consortium's sophisticated firewalls as if they were parchment. Every system aboard the Quill simultaneously screamed in agony. Navigation failed, targeting sensors went blind, and the serene internal lighting flickered and died, replaced by the jarring red of emergency alerts. His guards, products of a society that hadn't fought a pitched battle in centuries, looked around in helpless confusion, their pacification tools now useless trinkets. Then came the physical assault, executed with a surgical precision that was utterly obscene. A single, focused beam of kinetic energy, no wider than a man's arm, lanced down from the lead progenitor dreadnought. It didn't strike the ship's core or its bridge, a move of strategic decapitation Vorel might have understood. Instead, it pierced the engine housing with contemptuous ease, instantly vaporizing the primary drive coil and leaving the stelliferous Quill crippled, adrift, and entirely at their mercy. It was not an attack. It was a castration. Aboard the flagship Terminus Est, Legate Valerius observed the data stream on his command throne, his consciousness processing the unfolding events with a speed no organic mind could match. Valerius was not a man, not anymore. He was a ghost in the cog, a digital imprint of one of the progenitor empire's greatest military minds. His personality and tactical genius preserved in a quantum state mainframe and given command of the 9th Harrowing Fleet. He had slept for 5,000 years in the cold, silent heart of a gas giant, his fleet dormant around him, waiting for the signal, for the scent of the old enemy. Now he was awake, and the universe felt small and fragile. His sensors, far more advanced than anything the consortium possessed, had already dissected the stelliferous Quill, cataloging its weapon strengths, shield frequencies, and crew complement down to their metabolic rates. The vessel was an object of pathetic curiosity, a child's toy left on a battlefield of giants. Status of the primary signal, his synthesized voice, a calm and chilling baritone, echoed across the silent bridge, directly into the neural implants of his crew. His crew, the legionaries, were no more purely human than he was. They were vat-born, grown in the fleet's hidden birthing matrices and cybernetically integrated with their stations from adolescence. They were living components of the war machine, their flesh and blood a mere housing for the neural hardware that made them ruthlessly efficient. The harrowing protocol originated from a substrata bunker, Coordinates locked. A pilot droned, his eyes a placid silver as he interfaced with the ship. High energy readings consistent with restored progenitor technology. It is a legacy site. Valerius processed this. A legacy site meant survivors, legacy humans, unaugmented, primitive, and yet one of them had managed to awaken him. That was a tactical anomaly that required immediate investigation. Vaporize the alien vessel's comms array. He commanded. Disable. Do not destroy. I want their logs. Send the first cohort to the surface. Secure the bunker. Secure the signal's originator. I want to know who remembered how to ring the bell. Down below. Eris Thorne watched the sky burn through her bunker's reinforced viewport. The speed, the totality of the assault, was breathtaking and nauseating. She had read the progenitor war logs, but text on a datapad could not capture the reality of this cold, calculated violence. It was the difference between reading a definition of a predator and being in a cage with a starving one. The consortium ship was neutralized in seconds, its elegant form now marred by a single, smoldering wound. Then, the progenitor ships moved, their formations shifting with a terrifying, synchronized grace. Dozens of smaller, fang-like dropships detached from their motherships and streaked toward the planet's surface, their re-entry flames painting the sky in blood-red strokes. One of them, larger than the rest, was heading directly for her. The ground shook as it landed with a deafening crash that sent tremors through the bunker's foundation. Her ancient progenitor systems screamed proximity warnings. The blast door, thick enough to withstand a low-yield nuclear blast, groaned as something impossibly hot began to carve a perfect circle through its center. She backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs, clutching a useless data slate to her chest. She had called upon her ancestors for salvation, but the beings cutting through her door did not feel like saviors. They felt like an ending. The circular section of the door fell inward with a clang, and through the glowing, molten ring stepped a legionary. It was a giant, encased in gunmetal gray power armor that hummed with contained energy. Its helmet was a smooth, faceless plate of black obsidian, and it carried a pulse rifle with an indifferent readiness. It paused, its head tilting slightly as it scanned the room, its sensors cataloging her scavenged equipment, the musty smell of old books. Another followed, and then another, until her small workshop was filled with these silent, menacing demigods. They did not speak. One of them simply gestured with its rifle toward the breached door. The message was clear. She was marched across the scorched landing zone, the air thick with ozone and the taste of superheated metal. The dropship was a cavernous, utilitarian space, all exposed conduits and stark lighting, and it smelled of sterilized air and weapon lubricant. They strapped her into a crash seat without a word, and the ascent was brutal, pinning her with a force that made her vision swim. When they docked with the Terminus Est, the transition was jarring. The interior of the dreadnought was a cathedral of cold, dark metal, and crimson light. The air was thin and unnaturally still. She was led through vast corridors where legionaries moved with silent purpose, their augmented bodies casting long, intimidating shadows. There was no art, no comfort, only the stark, uncompromising geometry of a machine built for a single, terrible purpose. Finally, she was brought to the bridge. It was not a room of consoles and screens, but a vast, dark sphere. In the center, suspended in a web of shimmering energy conduits, was a crystalline throne. Seated upon it was a figure that was more a part of the machine than a man, his body fused with polished chrome and glowing circuitry. This was Legate Valerius. He didn't turn to look at her. She knew instinctively that he was aware of everything on his ship simultaneously. The legacy human. His voice echoed in her mind, not through the air. The telepathic intrusion was a violation, cold and clinical. You activated the harrowing protocol. Eris found her voice, though it trembled. Yes, the consortium. They were the enemy from the war logs. They were killing my people. Valerius processed her words, his lack of visible reaction more unnerving than any expression. The consortium is the devolved remnant of the Galactic Covenant, the same multi-species hegemony that fractured our empire. Their presence confirms a core tenet of the last mandate: the alien can never be trusted. Your action was correct. Your methodology, however, is a point of concern. You are an uncatalogued variant of baseline humanity. Your genome is untamed. Explain your existence. Eris was stunned. He wasn't congratulating her. He was interrogating her, classifying her like a new species of insect. We are the descendants of the survivors of the fall. We have lived on Ethel for thousands of years. The legate was silent for a long moment. A feral population. His thoughts finally returned, tinged with something that might have been academic interest. Fascinating. A control group left to the ravages of natural selection. Your preservation will be a secondary objective. Primary objective is the prosecution of this war. Your knowledge of this planet's progenitor ruins and the local feral population's customs will be a valuable asset. You are hereby seconded to my command staff as a native intelligence attaché. Meanwhile, aboard the crippled Stelliferous Quill, Prelate Vorel was in a state of controlled panic. His communication systems were obliterated, but a single, shielded quantum entanglement communicator, reserved for the highest priority messages, had survived the data scythe. He was dictating a frantic, desperate report to the Consortium High Council. It is not a primitive species, he relayed, his voice strained. I repeat, the Ethel colony are the direct descendants of the great enemy. The legends were true. Their technology did not fail. It was hidden. My uplift team inadvertently triggered a dormant military protocol of unimaginable scale. We are facing a resurrected progenitor fleet. Their tactical capability exceeds all known metrics. They are not conquerors, they are exterminators. They do not fight for territory. They fight for the complete eradication of all non-human intelligence. I have made a catastrophic error. We have not found a lost colony. We have opened a tomb. His message sent. He ordered the evacuation of all surviving personnel to the ship's few remaining lifeboats. Small craft he hoped the progenitors would deem too insignificant to notice. As his own pod ejected into the void, he looked back at the planet Ethel. He watched as the progenitor fleet settled into a perfect orbital blockade, their ships like sharks circling a bleeding meal. He saw hundreds more dropships descending, not just to the ruins, but to Oakhaven and the other valley settlements. They weren't landing to fight. They were landing to process, to catalog, to assess, and to conscript. The benevolent sociologist had wanted to uplift humanity into the light of civilization. Instead, he had just borne witness to their being dragged back into the glorious, terrifying darkness of their own past. Eris stood on the observation deck of the Terminus Est, looking down at her world through a vast armored window. The view was clearer than she had ever seen it. The progenitor fleet had already deployed atmospheric purifiers that were burning away the perpetual cloud cover, revealing a bruised and scarred landscape under the harsh light of its alien sun. Down in Oakhaven Valley, she could see the legionaries moving through the settlement. There was no violence, no struggle. The villagers, stunned into submission by the display of cosmic power, were being herded into organized lines. drones zipped between them, taking biological scans, assessing their physical fitness, and tagging them with subdermal markers. Children were being separated from their parents, sent to designated nurture cadres. The strong were being assigned to labor battalions. The intelligent, like herself, were being identified for cognitive asset integration. She had saved them from the consortium's gentle cultural erasure. She had saved them from a quick, bloody death at the hands of Prelate Voral's panicked guards. She had done it all to preserve their freedom, their humanity. But as she watched her people being methodically, emotionlessly processed and absorbed into the gears of an ancient and unrelenting war machine, a cold, sickening realization washed over her. She hadn't saved them at all. She had merely traded their cage for an iron fist. The term native intelligence attaché was a sterile euphemism for a role Eris could only describe as witness. Legate Valerius did not ask for her opinions or strategic counsel. He demanded her knowledge, extracting it with the dispassionate precision of a miner coring an ice shelf. She was taken from the bridge and escorted by 2 silent legionary guards to her own bunker, which had been methodically dismantled and reassembled within a vast, echoing hangar bay aboard the Terminus Est. Her books, her data slates, her half-repaired artifacts, her entire life's work was now evidence, cataloged and cross-referenced by the ship's analytical engines, and her purpose was to provide context. Valerius's mind, a perfect digital construct of military theory, could process 1,000 tactical variables per second, but it lacked a fundamental understanding of the chaotic, illogical drift of 5 millennia of feral human culture. He needed her to translate the myths, to explain why certain ruins were considered sacred taboo, which in his logic often pointed to the location of hidden armories or sensitive command nodes. Her first assignment was to oversee the aptitude indexing of the Oakhaven survivors. The legionaries had converted the village square, where Kalen and his wardens had been so horrifically executed, into a processing center. The air hummed with the low thrum of mobile scanning arches and genetic sequencers. Her people were moved through the lines, their faces a mixture of terror, confusion, and a strange, hollow resignation. They were stripped of their woven clothes and leather armor, scrubbed by sonic cleansing fields, and dressed in simple gray utility jumpsuits. Eris stood beside a legionary centurion, a towering figure whose armor was marked with the crimson slash of a command officer, and was forced to watch. She saw Ilara, the village elder who had taught her the ancient star myths, her wrinkled face pale as she was injected with a nanite tracker. She saw young Finn, a boy who used to bring her interesting bits of scrap metal, his eyes wide as a medical drone painlessly took a bone marrow sample. The legionaries were not cruel. Their actions were devoid of malice or any emotion at all. They were simply processing. The genetic stock is surprisingly pure. Valerius's voice echoed in her mind, a cold intrusion that made her flinch. Millennia of hardship have culled many of the suboptimal traits introduced during the late expansion era. Their physical resilience is 20% above baseline, an acceptable grade of raw material. Raw material. The words hung in Eris's mind, a verdict on everything she had ever known. She watched as a small group of former wardens, identified by their superior physical conditioning, were separated and led toward a waiting dropship. They weren't being imprisoned or punished. They were being fast-tracked for legionary candidacy, their bodies destined to be broken down and rebuilt into cybernetic soldiers, their minds wiped clean and replaced with loyalty protocols. She had unleashed the progenitors to save her people from becoming the consortium's pets, only to watch them be transformed into living weapons for a war they couldn't comprehend. Her salvation was a factory, and her people were the grist. Far across the galactic arm, I say, in the pristine, light-filled heart of the consortium capital, the message from Prelate Vorel arrived like a death knell. The High Council chamber was a marvel of bioarchitecture, grown from luminous coral and shaped by gravity fields, a place of peace and contemplation. Speaker Lyra, a member of the insectoid Cathar, her iridescent carapace shifting in the gentle light, listened as Vorel's frantic, terrified voice filled the hall. Her multifaceted eyes, capable of seeing in a dozen spectrums, blinked slowly as she absorbed the impossible truth. The human scourge, the progenitors. They were names from the consortium's darkest historical archives. A species so wantonly violent and expansionist that their final defeat 5,000 years ago was considered the foundational event of the modern galactic peace. Their existence was now treated as a cautionary fable, a myth used to frighten young spawn into obedience. But Vorel's report was backed by telemetry, by sensor logs, by the unmistakable energy signatures of a progenitor harrowing fleet. The myth had just walked out of the history books and set fire to their reality. An emergency session was convened. Representatives from 87 species filled the chamber, their voices a cacophony of clicks, whistles, and sonorous vibrations. Panic was a scent in the air. "We must send the Grand Armada," hissed the Vreen ambassador, a reptilian being whose species prized aggressive posturing. "We will crush this single, resurrected fleet before it can spread." Speaker Lyra raised a delicate, chitinous hand for silence. "The Grand Armada is a deterrent force. Ambassador, its 300 vessels are spread across 5 sectors. It has not mobilized for a unified military action in 1,000 years. Our admirals are diplomats. Our soldiers are peacekeepers." The truth was a bitter pill for them all. The consortium had become so successful, so peaceful, that it had forgotten how to wage war. Their strength was in consensus, in trade, in cultural assimilation. Their military was designed to police pirates and quell minor border disputes, not to fight a total war of annihilation against a species whose very culture was forged in the crucible of endless conflict. "Prelate Vorel's report is clear," Lyra continued, her voice cutting through the rising fear. "The progenitors do not negotiate. They do not conquer. They cleanse. They view our very existence as an infestation. If this is a true harrowing fleet, then it is only the beginning. The signal Vorel detected, it wasn't just a local alarm. It was a summons. They are waking up. We are not facing a fleet. We are facing a plague." A deep, cold dread settled over the council. They had spent millennia building a galaxy of peaceful cooperation, and had just been informed that the apocalypse had a name, and it was humanity. Aboard the Terminus Est, Eris was brought back to the bridge. Valerius had finished his initial analysis of the Ethel archives. Her work, her life's passion, had been digested and filed away as tactical data. "Your research has confirmed the location of 7 sleeper caches in this sector," the legate's thoughts informed her, displaying a holographic star chart in front of her. "Ordnance depots, dormant shipyards, and secondary fleet mustering points, inefficiently hidden using mythological camouflage, a common tactic of the late Empire." He highlighted one system, a red giant star designated G74. "Your myths refer to this star as the Dragon's Eye. They speak of a celestial forge hidden in its corona where the progenitor gods forged their thunderbolts. This is a high-confidence match for the Anvil Station, a primary battlecruiser manufactory." He then turned the star chart, focusing on a nearby blue dwarf. "And this system, Tethys, is currently occupied." A consortium tritanium mining colony. Population 12,000. Minimal defensive capabilities. A soft target. Eris felt a wave of nausea. She knew what was coming. "You intend to attack them," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Attack is an inaccurate term," Valerius corrected. "It implies a struggle. This is a sanitation protocol. The alien presence in the Tethys system is a tactical liability and a biological contaminant. It must be purged before we reactivate Anvil Station." He was going to wipe out 12,000 innocent people as a simple preparatory measure, with no more thought than she would give to sweeping dust from her workshop floor. "You cannot," she pleaded, taking a step forward before the silent threat of the legionary guards froze her in place. "They are not soldiers. They are miners. Families. Irrelevant." The legate's voice cut through her protest, sharp and absolute. "Their existence is an error. We are the correction." He gave the order without fanfare, without a moment of hesitation. "Execute fleet jump to the Tethys system. Upon arrival, launch the cleansing protocol. No alien vessel is to escape the gravity well. No alien life sign is to remain on any planetary body. Leave nothing but dust and echoes." The drive core of the Terminus Est began to thrum, a sound that vibrated deep in Eris's bones. The fabric of space visible in the main view screen twisted, contorted, and then tore open into a shimmering, non-Euclidean tunnel of light and shadow. The 9th harrowing fleet plunged into the void. The journey lasted only minutes. But for Eris, it was an eternity spent in a state of suspended horror. When they emerged, the view was of a tranquil star system. A small, well-ordered space station orbited a rocky, airless moon, and the gentle lights of a domed colony shimmered on its surface. She could see the tiny glints of cargo ships moving between the two. These were the people Valerius had sentenced to death. Without warning, the progenitor fleet unleashed hell. It was not a battle. It was a harvest. Swarms of autonomous hunter-killer drones, the size of her fist, were launched in a single, glittering cloud. They moved faster than the eye could follow, evading the colony's pathetic automated defenses and slicing through the unarmored hulls of the cargo ships. Torrents of gray nanites were fired in torpedoes, washing over the colony dome. Eris watched on a magnified screen as the nanites touched the dome's transparent surface, instantly beginning to disassemble it at a molecular level. Within seconds, the dome collapsed, exposing the colony to the hard vacuum of space. Valerius did not bother to waste ordnance on the station. He simply deployed a single gravity lance, a weapon that fired a micro-singularity. The station, the moon it orbited, and the fleeing lifeboats were all pulled into a single, screaming point of compressed matter and then vanished with a silent flash of hawking radiation. From fleet emergence to total system sterilization, the entire operation took less than 5 minutes. Eris stared at the empty space where a colony had been, where 12,000 living, breathing beings had just existed. Her hands were trembling, and she looked down at them, at the historian's hands that had dug through the dust, that had pieced together the past, that had typed the command that awakened this thing. She had called for a savior, and a devil had answered. And the devil knew her name. The silence in the wake of the Tethys system's eradication was a living entity aboard the Terminus Est. It was the silence of a tomb, of a freshly dug grave. For Eris, it was the sound of her own complicity. The fleet's jump to the G774 system, the Dragon's Eye, was instantaneous, but the psychic stain of 12,000 silent screams seemed to cling to her, a phantom limb of guilt she could never amputate. She no longer saw the legionaries as her ancestors' saviors. She saw them as walking monuments to a glorious homicidal past. She no longer heard Valerius's mental voice as the commands of a brilliant general, but as the cold, dispassionate calculations of an abacus clicking off souls. The historian in her had sought truth, and the truth she found was this: the progenitors had not been fighting a war for survival against the old Galactic Covenant. They had been engaged in a crusade, a holy war to claim a galaxy they believed was theirs by right of birth, and any species that stood in their way was not an enemy to be defeated, but a weed to be uprooted. Her despair, which had been a cold, heavy stone in her gut, began to burn. It was the slow, smoldering burn of pure, undiluted hatred. She was a witness, yes, but even a witness could choose what to see, what to remember, and what to change. In the gleaming heart of the consortium, Admiral Xylo of the avian Gesh species stood before the High Council, his graying plumage ruffled not with age, but with profound irritation. Xylo was a creature of the old school, one of the few remaining military commanders who had studied the great enemy not as myth, but as a historical military case study. He had been sidelined for decades, his warnings about the dangers of total demilitarization dismissed as the paranoid ramblings of a warmonger in an age of peace. Now, those same politicians who had mocked him were looking at him with the desperate eyes of frightened hatchlings. "Your request for the Grand Armada is denied," Speaker Lyra stated, her tone apologetic but firm. Mobilizing such a force would take months and would create a power vacuum in a dozen sectors, inviting piracy and opportunism. "We cannot show the galaxy we are in chaos." Xylo clicked his beak in frustration. "Speaker, you are debating the color of the curtains while the house is on fire. This harrowing fleet just sterilized a system in under 5 minutes. 5 minutes. We are not in chaos yet, but we are on a schedule to become cosmic dust." After a contentious debate, a compromise was reached, one that tasted like ash in Xylo's mouth. He was given command of the First Response Fleet, a hastily assembled collection of 70 ships pulled from customs patrols and anti-piracy duties. It was a fleet of police cutters, light frigates, and retrofitted science vessels, armed with little more than stun cannons and kinetic point defense guns. Against a progenitor dreadnought, they might as well be throwing rocks. His orders were to intercept, observe, and report. He was being sent to die, and everyone in the room knew it. His real mission was not to fight, but to be the galaxy's first, and likely last, eyewitness to the full capabilities of the resurrected human war machine. Aboard the Terminus Est, Eris was summoned once more, not to the bridge, but to her own reassembled workshop. Valerius's voice manifested in her mind as she stood amidst her familiar clutter, the scent of old paper and dust a strange comfort in the sterile warship. "The reactivation of Anvil Station is imminent. The station's core command files are encrypted with a series of archaic linguistic keys based on Old Terran mythology. Your feral culture's preservation of these myths, however distorted, makes your cognitive processes uniquely suited to assist in their decryption. You will translate the final ignition protocols for the primary stellar forge." A holographic display shimmered into existence before her, filled with glyphs and text that made her heart leap. It was a dialect of High Progenitor she had only ever seen in fragments, a security cant filled with ritualistic and metaphorical language. It was a lock, and her mind was the key. As she began to work, and her guards standing like statues behind her, an idea, as desperate and dangerous as a lit match in an ammunition depot, began to form. Valerius was a being of pure logic. He could not comprehend irrationality, inefficiency, or the strange, powerful influence of belief that had so shaped her peoples and the progenitors past. He saw myth as a primitive data-hiding technique. He did not understand that myth has its own power, its own truth. The protocols for the forge ignition were complex, a litany of energy transfers and conduit alignments. But one section caught her eye, a passage detailing the final, critical moment of bringing the forge online by channeling the plasma of the dragon's eye star itself. The text was almost a poem. And when the heart of the dragon is breached, its fire must be purified, lest its chaotic rage shatter the anvil. Let the stellar flame first turn upon itself, to burn away its own dross in a cycle of glorious self-consumption, before it is tamed to forge the steel of our dominion. Eris felt a jolt, a surge of adrenaline that made her fingers tremble over the holographic controls. The passage was describing a controlled feedback loop, a safety feature, yes, but one that could be exaggerated. With meticulous care, she began her translation. She didn't change the words, but she altered the emphasis, the context. She cross-referenced the passage with obscure myths her people told about the dragon's eye, myths of the star dragon devouring its own tail before being tamed by the gods. She presented the feedback loop not as a minor, instantaneous safety check, but as a crucial, primary step in the ignition process, a required purging cycle that, according to her fabricated historical analysis, needed to vent a massive, focused burst of the star's energy back into its own chromosphere to stabilize the station's energy matrix for the first time in millennia. It was a lie wrapped in a dozen layers of truth, a logic bomb hidden in a history lesson. To a logical mind like Valerius, deliberately venting that much energy would seem catastrophically inefficient. But to a mind trying to understand the seemingly irrational rituals of its powerful but archaic creators, it might just seem like a necessary, if bizarre, precaution. She spent hours crafting the document, her every nerve alight. When she was finished, she transmitted the file, a single tainted drop of poison into the ocean of data that was the legate's consciousness. The wait was the purest form of torture. She was left alone in her workshop, the silence pressing in on her. She had either just signed her own death warrant, or she had forged the first weapon in a new war. Finally, the voice returned to her mind. Your analysis of the ignition ritual is baroque. The energy expenditure of the proposed purging cycle is grossly inefficient, a flaw in the original design. A cold dread washed over Eris. He had seen through it. However, the voice continued, the station has been dormant for 5 millennia. The original engineers may have factored in a level of system degradation that my models cannot predict. A brute force energy flush to clear and cauterize the primary conduits is a crude but logical failsafe. Your recommendation is accepted. The anvil will be brought online. Eris nearly collapsed with a relief so profound it felt like pain. The fleet had arrived. Through her viewport, she could see Anvil Station, a colossal ring of black iron kilometers in diameter, hanging in the corona of the red giant G774. It was a terrifying, beautiful sight, a testament to the sheer, arrogant power of her ancestors. The reactivation sequence began. Legionary engineering teams in shielded vessels swarmed over the station, activating dormant power relays. A beam of energy lanced out from the Terminus Est, a key turning in a lock 5,000 years old. Lights began to flicker to life across the station's surface. On the bridge, Valerius watched, his digital consciousness focused on the thousands of data streams pouring in from the awakening station. And then, A new alert flashed in the periphery of his awareness. Energy signature detected at the system's edge. A Legionary pilot reported, his voice flat. Multiple vessels, non-progenitor design, primitive drive signatures. Valerius focused a sensor array. 70 small, underarmed ships had just dropped out of subspace. The consortium's first response fleet. Admiral Xylo stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Vigil. His feathers slicked down with nervous sweat as he stared at the tactical display. The progenitor fleet was there, as predicted. But Anvil Station, the energy readings were off the scale. It was powering up. They're activating it right now, his sensor officer squawked. Sir, what are our orders? Xylo looked at the enemy fleet, then at the colossal star forge they were resurrecting. His orders were to observe. But he knew, with the chilling certainty of a career warrior, that if that station came online, the war was over before it even began. Below, on the Terminus S, the final command was given. The station's primary conduits opened, drinking deep from the raging red sun, and Eris Thorne, a historian from a forgotten world, held her breath and prayed to any god that would listen that the dragon would, indeed, devour itself. The heart of the dragon's eye convulsed. On the bridge of the Terminus Est, alarms, silent for millennia, shrieked across the neural network. The energy flowing from the star into Anvil Station was not the steady, tamed river Valerius's models had predicted. It was a torrent, a tidal wave of incandescent plasma, magnitudes greater than required. The feedback loop Eris had woven into the translation was not just a safety purge, it was a command to open the floodgates. The station's ancient, dormant systems, designed to handle a controlled flow, were being force-fed the raw, untamed fury of a star. Energy spike exceeds all safety parameters, a Legionary's synthesized voice announced, a hint of something like surprise coloring its monotone. The stellar conduits are overloading. The magnetic containment field is failing. Legate Valerius processed this new data with the speed of light, his consciousness racing to find a solution. He saw Eris's deception instantly. A single, elegant variable of irrationality he had dismissed as archaic ritual. It was not a flaw in the original design. It was sabotage. A logic bomb wrapped in poetry. He had been so focused on the alien threat from without that he had never considered the feral human within his own ship could be a weapon. Aboard the Vigil, Admiral Xylo watched his screens turn from red to blinding white. The energy signature from Anvil Station was no longer just powering up, it was going critical. It's going to blow, his helm officer shrieked, his avian voice cracking with panic. That thing is a bomb, and they just lit the fuse. Xylo's mind, honed by decades of studying the progenitor's ruthless logic, saw the situation in a flash. This wasn't an accident. This was an opportunity. A 1 in a trillion chance bought with someone else's blood. All ships, he roared, his voice cutting through the rising panic on the bridge. Target the station's primary energy conduits, the ones flaring brightest. Fire everything we have. We are not observing anymore. We are pushing the domino. His fleet, a pathetic collection of cutters and frigates, obeyed without hesitation. Their kinetic cannons and plasma bolts were gnats attacking a leviathan, but their target was not the station's armor. It was its open, bleeding wound. Each impact, however small, destabilized the failing containment field just a little more, accelerating the catastrophe. On the Terminus Est, Valerius made a decision with the cold pragmatism that had defined his existence. Anvil Station was lost. Salvaging it was no longer the primary objective. Survival was. Jettison the docking clamps. Hull reverse thrust. All ships. Disengage from the station and prepare for emergency jump. His thoughts commanded the fleet. As the progenitor vessels began to pull away from the self-destructing station, a single, secondary command was issued, a footnote to the unfolding disaster. Detain the native intelligence attaché. She is to be preserved for interrogation and vivisection. Her capacity for illogical, asymmetrical warfare is a tactical variable that requires study. The legionary guards in Eris's workshop turned toward her, their faceless helmets seeming to stare right through her soul. But Eris was already moving. In the instant the first alarms had sounded, she had grabbed the heaviest, sharpest piece of progenitor scrap she could lift, the jagged shard of a memory crystal, and slammed it into the control panel by the door. Sparks flew, and the door hissed shut, its magnetic lock shorting out. It wouldn't hold them for long, but she didn't need long. She had one last part to play. She scrambled to the reassembled console of her bunker, her hands flying across the familiar controls of the long-range comms unit she had spent a decade restoring. She didn't know the consortium's frequencies, but she didn't need them. She set the device to broadcast on all channels, an unfiltered, wide-spectrum scream into the void. The Terminus S shuddered as it tore itself away from the dying station. In the chaos, Valerius's attention was divided. His primary consciousness was managing the fleet's retreat, calculating safe jump vectors that accounted for the coming shockwave. Part of his processing power was focused on containing the damage, while another was already formulating a new strategy, one that now included feral human ingenuity as a significant threat variable. He spared only a fraction of a thought for the two legionaries attempting to cut through the workshop door. It was a minor, internal matter, a mistake. And then, a new signal flooded his comms channels. It wasn't encrypted, it wasn't progenitor, it was raw, unaugmented audio. The voice of Eris Thorn, broadcast to his entire fleet and to the tiny consortium ships still firing on the station. To the monsters who call themselves my ancestors. Her voice rang out, shaking with fear but clear as a bell. You believe you are the rightful heirs to the galaxy. You are a disease, a plague of iron and certainty that would burn 1,000 worlds for the sake of a dead dream. Then, her broadcast shifted, her words becoming a desperate plea to the alien ships. To the consortium, to Admiral Xylo of the First Response Fleet. You see what they are. You see their power. They will not stop. They will not reason. But they can be beaten. Anvil Station was their heart. I have cracked it open for you. Now you must break it. The message ended, but its impact was seismic. Valerius felt it as a wave of dissonance in his legionary crews, a flicker of confusion in the otherwise perfect logic of their programming. For the first time, they were hearing dissent not from an alien, but from a human, a creator. Admiral Xylo, his ship rattling from the energy waves pulsing off the station, heard the message and felt a chill run down his spine. This feral human, she hadn't just set a trap. She had given them a banner, a reason to fight beyond mere survival. Keep firing, he bellowed. For the consortium, for her. It was in that moment that Anvil Station died. The magnetic containment field finally collapsed, and the full, unrestrained power of a red giant star's core erupted outwards. It was not an explosion. It was a nova, a wave of pure energy, a cleansing fire that vaporized everything it touched. The closest progenitor ships, unable to jump in time, were unmade, their brutal iron hulls vanishing in a silent, incandescent flash. The shockwave slammed into the Terminus Est, throwing it tumbling through space, its shield screaming and buckling. Further out, Xylo's fleet was tossed about like leaves in a storm, their systems fried, their hulls breached. But by some miracle, most of them survived. When the light faded, there was nothing left. Anvil Station was gone. A third of the 9th harrowing fleet was gone. The Dragon's Eye star, its chromosphere ripped open, burned with a chaotic, wounded fury. Legate Valerius pulled his ship and his mind from the brink of chaos. Damage reports flooded in. His fleet was crippled. His legionaries were disoriented. And the human was gone. The workshop and that entire section of the hangar bay had been vaporized in the nova. She had died, but she had taken the heart of his fleet with her. He looked at the surviving consortium ships, battered but defiant. Slowly regrouping, he looked at the empty space where his great victory was supposed to have been born. He had encountered 2 anomalies in this system. The first was the consortium, an enemy that was weak but unwilling to break. The second was Eris Thorn, a human who was primitive but possessed a weapon more dangerous than any dreadnought, the power to believe in something other than victory. The war was not over. He still had a fleet. He would rebuild. He would adapt. He now understood that the feral humans were not just raw material, they were a catalyst, an unknown variable that had to be controlled. His mission was no longer just to cleanse the galaxy of aliens. It was to reclaim his own people from the chaos of hope, of belief, of freedom. He set a course for Ethel, the world of dust and regret where this all began. He would turn that planet into a forge, and he would hammer the feral humans into the shape he required, no matter the cost. Admiral Xylo, his ship running on emergency power, watched the remnants of the progenitor fleet limp away into subspace. He had survived. Against all odds, they had won a victory, of a kind. But it was a victory that felt like a prelude to a funeral. He thought of the woman's voice, the historian who had sacrificed herself to give them a chance. She had called her ancestors a disease, but in her defiance, she had also shown him the cure. The consortium had feared humanity as a monolithic scourge, but they were not one thing. They were fractured. They were at war with themselves. And in that division, Xylo saw the galaxy's only hope. His report to the High Council would be simple. They were not facing a god of war. They were facing an empire on the verge of a civil war. And the galaxy had just been handed an invitation to choose a side. The age of peace was over. The age of humanity, in all its terrible, fractured, and defiant glory, had truly, finally begun.